Please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. Thank you. Something in the fog. The nest of 20 gargoyles had settled into the town of Normal fairly quickly over the last 2 months. Half of them had taken on the role of deputies, while the town still only had Sheriff Rhodes as Normal's official sheriff. Nick's sister Andrea had taken up the position of head deputy for the night shift crew. While crime in Normal itself was hardly what one could call rampant, there was a vast improvement compared to earlier in the year. Nick himself had opted to take an evening position at the Witch's Brew Bakery. While business was hardly booming at night, Nick prepped many goods for the following day, allowing the owner, Amelia Rose, the option to sleep in, something she greatly appreciated. He had just finished the first round of dough that would be used for bread and was getting ready to prepare some pie crusts. Autumn was in full swing. It was currently just past 11, and like clockwork, the main lobby entrance bell jingled to announce the arrival of Eric Ryder, one of Normal's best mechanics. Also, Sheriff Rhodes, stepson. On the counter, called Nick from the kitchen as he slid the second tray of bread dough into its metal rack slot. He then did a quick glance in the mirror above the washing sink to make sure he didn't have any extra flour on his face, and slung his apron onto a hook just inside the kitchen door. As he stepped out into the dining area, instead of seeing Eric, a gentleman in a fine tailored suit stood before the counter. Well-groomed, not a hair out of place, not a wrinkle to be found upon his clothes. His black leather dress shoes were perfectly shined. This man was the definition of impeccable. Nick stopped short but quickly shifted his look of surprise to warm and welcoming. "Evening," he started. "Sorry, I thought you were someone else. How can I help you?" The gentleman matched his smile in return. His teeth were pure white and straight, utterly perfect. It was very clear to Nick that the man before him wasn't human, not surprising being the town of Normal. Most residents were usually something beyond human, even the people just passing through. "Apologies," said the gentleman. "I was hoping to garner your and your friend's assistance regarding a matter of great importance." Nick, curious but not stupid, reflexively folded his arms but regarded the man before him with curiosity. If there was one thing most supernaturals learned at a young age, asking and providing help always came with a price. Nick gestured for the man to continue when the door's bell rang once more and a grease-stained, lean-muscled, blonde mechanic of 25 years entered into the bakery. He wore the smell of rubber, sweat, and oil like it was cologne. He stopped short when he noticed the finely dressed gentleman standing in front of the counter. While the gentleman's smile hadn't faltered, it somehow seemed more pleased with Eric's arrival. He stepped away from the counter slightly and gestured towards the covered plate, resting on it. Eric, after pausing for a moment, made his way up to his waiting dinner and shifted his look from the gentleman to Nick, one eyebrow furrowing upward. Nick could only shrug in response. Eric returned the shrug in kind, a habit he'd picked up from Nick, before removing the cover and taking his plate, a club sandwich on wheat, extra bacon, and salt and vinegar chips, with a whole pickle on the side. He took a seat at a nearby table. The gentleman cleared his throat. "I require the assistance of each of you in acquiring an item of grave importance." Eric turned back to Nick, confused. "He wants to hire the two of us for a job," Nick explained. "Us?" said Eric. "Dude, there's a whole bunch of other people in the town who are better able to get something of grave importance than a twilight shift working mechanic and a gargoyle who bakes." Nick wouldn't normally care for Eric to share his true nature with a stranger. But even Eric could see the guy wasn't human. Plus, he couldn't argue. Sure, as a gargoyle he had speed and strength, but in the supernatural world so did most things. That was the thing about most monsters. Everyone was a predator with the same two tricks: run it down and bash its brains in. As for Eric, he was an outright human, a total normie. No magic, no shape-shifting, nothing. The gentleman wasn't deterred. "You will be financially compensated, of course. The task itself is quite simple. You only need to travel to an abandoned town, speak with the Father Green, and have him provide you the item in question." Nick was about to say no thanks, but Eric raised his hand, indicating for Nick to wait. His eyes narrowed as he paid closer attention to the gentleman. He took a swig of soda he'd pulled from his overalls pocket. "How much?" he asked. The gentleman's smile returned once more. "Always a price," he said. Late Saturday afternoon, Nick and Eric found themselves in the small, abandoned ghost town of Usher's Tarn. The place was 4 hours out of Normal and pulled right out of a horror game. Dilapidated and vandalized buildings ran along the main street. What windows that weren't broken were boarded up, gray, dirty, and abandoned. Most of the graffiti was faded and peeling off the brick walls they had been tagged on. The gentleman had provided a shared location through the Mappy app. St. Michael's Angelic Reverence, the only church in the clearly God-forsaken town, located at the end of Main Street and the corner of Heaven's Gate Boulevard, where they would locate the item of grave importance. Due to the subtle emphasis on the word grave, Nick and Eric were surprised the gentleman hadn't provided them with shovels. Eric pulled his all-terrain Jeep into the empty parking lot of St. Michael's Church. An eerie silence crept over the two of them after the Jeep's engine went silent. "Sure about this?" asked Nick. "Nope, but I've done a lot of stupider things than this, and hadn't been offered 50 grand. Eric reached under the passenger seat from the back and slid out a flat safe. He pressed his thumb to the lock, and with a ping, the lock clicked open. Inside was a Desert Eagle .50 AE, all black. He loaded a full clip, checked the safety, and holstered it along his hip once he stepped out of the Jeep, sliding the safe under the driver's side seat. Nick stepped out too. He considered dropping his glamour and shifting to full gargoyle, but realized that Father Green may not be appreciative of his true nature. Historically, gargoyles were known for protecting holy places from evil, and there was some accuracy to the stories, but there is a vast difference between scary statues and the real deal. Nick jerked and shot Eric a look after Eric double-hit the lock button and set the Jeep's alarm, which was verified with a honk of acknowledgement. Eric mouthed the word sorry. Nick shrugged. They made their way towards the church's main entrance. While the outside of the church had matched the aesthetic of the rest of the town, they found the church foyer and inner sanctuary surprisingly undamaged and untouched by time or decay. Its appearance pristine. No dust, rot, or mold to be found. The pews were in perfect condition. Bibles resting in the bench pockets were in decent quality, showing signs of being well-loved but not mistreated. Where the two had a sense of unease outside, they found a sense of peace within the church's walls. As they approached the pulpit, which resided in front of a stained glass window, depicting an archangel, probably Michael, with extended wings, fully armored, and looking towards the heavens, wielding a flaming greatsword or flamberge. Both men jumped at the reserved "hello" they received from behind them. They turned towards their greeter only to step back as Father Green, they presumed, floated slightly off the ground and was quite transparent. Father Green chuckled. "I take it the gentleman didn't provide you with all the details." Nick and Eric shook their heads in unison. Being familiar with the supernatural, the two of them were hardly bothered by the fact that they were talking with a ghost. Nick had met plenty in his 25 years, but one could never be too careful with such beings. Always keeping things close to the chest, that one, but then again, being the Summer Queen's champion, he's learned well the importance of holding his tongue. Father Green chuckled, and then with some focus, allowed his form to solidify. Nick and Eric shared a look. For a spirit to achieve corporealization requires a fair amount of power and practice. Father Green was old, even by ghost standards. "Now then," said Father Green, stepping around the two of them and heading towards a table sitting before Michael's glass mosaic. The table was shrouded in a pure white linen cloth, unstained or wrinkled. Upon that sat a lone oak box, the wood smooth, polished, and gleaming. It occurred to Nick at that moment that the room was lit up, but there was no actual source of light emanating from anything. It just was. Eric paused and looked back at him, questioning why he had stopped. Father Green started Nick as he passed Eric and stepped next to the table. "Yes," Father Green asked. "The light," Nick motioned around them. Father Green smiled at that. "Very good. Most people don't catch on so quickly." He gestured to the image of the archangel. Heaven's light never dims within these walls as long as the eternal blade remains. Eternal blade? Asked Eric, coming up to the other side of the table, arms folded. Father Green nodded. The item you're here to collect. He then unclasped the two latches holding the lid of the box shut and popped it open with no resistance. Inside a gold satin interior lined the box where a greatsword rested. You got to be freaking kidding me, Eric quickly amended, showing Father Green a sheepish smile as the Holy Spirit gave him a disapproving glance. It's not the real thing, of course, said Father Green, but a holy replica of great importance and significance. But it's just a replica, said Nick, though he couldn't deny the sanctified energy emanating off the weapon. Replica in appearance, not function. It is a powerful tool blessed by an angel of heaven itself, elaborated Father Green. And, Eric said dubiously, you're giving it to the Summer Fae Court? Father Green smiled warmly. I've been advised this tool will better serve outside these walls. He then turned to Eric. But the gentleman is aware it is a loan and to be returned. Why didn't he come and get it himself? Asked Nick. He can't touch it, answered Father Green. Then how do we give it to him? Asked Eric. Father Green shrugged at that. I'm certain he's made arrangements. Why can't he touch it? Asked Nick. Father Green removed the weapon with a wave of his hand and levitated it before Nick. Ghosts, strong ones, develop telekinesis among other psychic abilities, as their very existence was a state of being allowed to exist through force of will, though there was an element of spiritual energy as well. Nick took the weapon tentatively. The light it emitted glowed warmly and seemed to become stronger. Father Green nodded. Humans, Angelus, and gargoyles are capable of wielding such a holy relic. Other supernatural beings could hold the weapon, but it would just be a blade in their hands. What about fae, demons, and vampires? Asked Eric, adding on the last two as a guess. They would have unpleasant results, to say the least, answered Father Green. Now, regarding your escape. Escape, Nick and Eric said in unison. Father Green sighed, the look of displeasure returning to his face. It would seem the gentleman has done you a disservice. He motioned for them to follow. As he went forward, he faded into an incorporeal state once more. Nick snagged the sheath strap that had been under the blade and quickly placed it over his shoulder. Eric slid the weapon into said sheath for Nick. He then snagged the box, holding it across his chest, as both hastily followed Father Green. This town has a history of violence. This place, indicating the church, isn't a bastion of light in the darkness, but a prison of condemnation. For what? Asked Nick. The void is a place of nothing, and in between that is darkness itself, kept separate from earth, heaven, and hell, said Father Green. But sometimes there are people or places of such evil that the darkness can bleed through. And this is such a place, said Nick. Father Green nodded. I'll spare you the details, but know that this place would very much like to see that weapon destroyed. Well, since we're taking it out of the town, maybe they'll be happy to see it go, said Eric. Father Green reached out his hand and placed it over Eric's firearm. The Desert Eagle emitted a holy glow. Its very existence binds the darkness to this place. If the weapon is whole, the void and its beasts may not leave here willingly beyond its borders. Then should we really be taking it? Asked Nick. Father Green nodded with certainty. There is something far worse outside the boundaries of this vile place. That weapon will play a vital role in keeping it at bay, if not eliminating it directly. What good is a hammer that is never used to strike a nail? Did you just bless my weapon? Asked Eric, who was admiring the glow now emanating from his holster. Yes, but only for the current ammunition, said Father Green. Use them sparingly and wisely. Wouldn't happen to have an ink ribbon and an old-fashioned typewriter you could spare too? Asked Eric jokingly. Afraid not, my son, said Father Green. Once you step out those doors, head straight out of town. Don't turn back. Both Nick and Eric nodded. Any other advice? Nick asked. Father Green smiled. He had a moment of hesitation as if contemplating his next words carefully, before saying, If you do happen to get lost, remember knowledge is power and stop to smell the roses. The second part seems contradictory to the first bit of advice about getting out of town, said Eric. God be with you, my children. Then Father Green faded into nothing. Both Nick and Eric shared a look, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. A thick fog enveloped everything. They could barely make out 5 feet in front of them. Great, muttered Eric. We just stepped into the real-life version of Quiet Mountain. Luckily, we don't have any emotional baggage, said Nick. Dude, we're men in our 20s. We have nothing but emotional baggage, responded Eric. That's just stereotyping, said Nick. Let's get to the car. Jeep, corrected Eric. He resisted the urge to punch Nick in the shoulder as they headed back to the Jeep. They had barely left the church steps when a despondent moan ripped through the air. Wanting to spare his 7 rounds of ammo, Eric immediately positioned the sword's box as an awkward makeshift club in his hands. Nick slid the greatsword out with ease and gripped it tightly with both hands while taking a base stance. After a moment's pause, whatever had made the noise didn't seem to be approaching. The two nodded and hustled to the Jeep. Eric tossed the box into the back seat and quickly jumped into the driver's side. The greatsword, sheathed once more, rested across both his and Eric's lap. Really, dude, said Eric as he turned the ignition over. I can get in the back if I have to, said Nick. Eric just shook his head and accelerated the Jeep forward after putting on his fog lights. Taking his Jeep off-road was par for the course for Eric. He had learned the importance of being able to cross over most terrain and being able to see through it. While the fog lights didn't eliminate their reduced vision by much, it at least made Eric feel more in control as they headed out of town. He was tempted to gun it down Main Street directly and get them out of the town as fast as possible, but something told him to keep a regular pace and stay alert. Nick was about to offer his own feelings about that fact when a voidling charged out of the fog and rammed itself directly into the side of the Jeep. A sickening crunch could be heard as the driver's side door was dented inward. The voidling appeared as a large, sleek black cat, like that of a mountain lion, minus the head, which was instead the equivalent of an eldritch horror. It had no eyes and 4 tentacles around its maw, lashing through the air, desperate to attach themselves to their next meal. Eric, who swore as the hit, caused both him and Nick to shift violently to the right. Nick's shoulder solidly connected with the passenger side window, and both would be experiencing some minor neck trauma from the sudden shift in direction. Just as they felt they started to recover, another voidling charged the passenger side, providing similar results. "Eric!" yelled Nick as he pointed forward. "On it," said Eric before deciding to throw caution to the wind and pushing the accelerator down with nothing more than a desire to survive. They made it past a couple of the vacant stores when one of the voidlings from before, or perhaps a new one, rushed directly into their path, ready to act as a living barricade. Eric, reacting quickly, swerved the Jeep to the left and around the third voidling. With both men bouncing, Nick quickly grabbed the "oh shit" handle as they bounded off the curb onto the sidewalk. Thankfully, Eric avoided dim streetlights and a phone booth as he swerved back onto the road. Eric had one singular goal in mind: getting them out of town alive. Technically, that may have been 2, but they pretty much went hand in hand. "Eric!" yelled Nick again. "What?" Eric yelled back before he noticed Nick was focused on something behind them. Eric glanced at the rearview mirror when, even in the fog, he was able to make out the voidlings merging into one another. He then lost sight of them and refocused his attention on the road, trying to pick up speed, only to quickly glance in the rearview mirror again and see a dire, voidling mountain lion of death bounding out of the fog and leaping over his Jeep to land in front of them, its paw raised in the air, ready to deliver a crushing blow. Eric slammed on the brakes, just bringing themselves up short of the 12-foot-tall monster. Nick slid out of the Jeep. Well, he shoulder-slammed the damaged passenger door open, kicked it shut, then he hit the ground running. He shifted to full gargoyle as he drew the greatsword into a high stance position after discarding the sheath. The massive voidling swiped down with feline speed as it hissed at Nick. Nick flapped his wings to provide some extra momentum and dodged backwards, narrowly avoiding the strike. Thinking fast, Nick slashed the sword downward at the exposed paw. The voidling howled in pain as the divine weapon easily bit into its flesh. He yanked his paw back, and a long, serpent-like tongue slathered in acidic saliva began to nurse the wound and mend the flesh. Nick pressed his luck and rushed forward again with a middle guard stance and thrust the greatsword into the voidling's midsection. The voidling's cry of pain was ear-splitting. Nick, ignoring the ringing in his ears, pulls the greatsword back, then stabs again. The voidling rears back and brings its acid-coated paw crashing down to smash Nick where he stands. "Move," yelled Eric. Nick, after freeing the blade again, uses his wings once more and springs backwards to fully disengage from the beast. The ringing in his ears starting to subside. He had barely heard Eric's warning. The voidling still would have landed a blow, but Eric, after forcing open his door, had released 2 shots into the voidling from his gun. While the small bullets did little damage, the fact that they were also blessed added an extra punch. The voidling turned his attention to Eric. Nick realized that with something this large, he needed to hit something more vital than its body. While he wasn't sure of the monster's true internal organ structure, he was pretty sure its brain was in its malformed head. He needed to get to higher ground and fast. He rushed away from the voidling, yelling for Eric to keep it distracted. "Distracted how?" Eric yells back. Nick shrugged as he snagged the sword sheath off the ground. After sheathing the greatsword and swinging it over his shoulder, he began scaling a nearby business, his claws finding purchase if not making their own as he ascended the wall with surprising speed and ease. Eric, still not wanting to waste any more ammo, especially on this H.P. Lovecraft nightmare baby, dove back into his Jeep, slamming the door shut with some effort and threw it into reverse. He started the radio, blasting heavy metal out of the speakers, Bloody Angels of Hell, and laid into his horn. The voidling, seeming to have recovered from the initial pain and injuries, pounced forward. Eric, thinking quickly, makes a desperate, sharp turn, nearly overturning his Jeep, just managing to go back into a nearby alley, ripping off his driver's side mirror as it careened into the corner wall of a business. While Eric was successful in avoiding being turned into a cat toy, he quickly realized the alley was a dead end and he had effectively trapped himself, like a rat. Just as the huge voidling turned its sightless gaze on him and its maw of wreathing tentacles reached towards him. "I'm so dead," said Eric. Nick ran off the building's roof and took flight after seeing Eric drive off and get lost in the fog. Gargoyles can fly, but they weren't birds and could only travel short distances by air. Thankfully, Nick's target was only 50 feet away, and despite the fog, there was a clearly distinguishable shadowy outline. He glided over and a good piece above the monster, then folded his wings in so that he torpedoed out of the sky. Greatsword at the ready, and with his increased momentum, he embedded the blade deep into the base of the voidling's skull, severing its brainstem. The monster collapsed forward onto the ground with a resounding thud. Nick caught some additional air as he sprang open his wings and fluttered down to the ground. The giant voidling dissipated back into the void itself. Eric, after a moment, pulled out of the alley and pulled up alongside Nick, who had returned to his human form, greatsword in the scabbard once more, and jumped back into the passenger seat. "That was fun," said Nick. "You're paying for my side mirror," muttered Eric before gunning the engine, safety be damned, and headed towards the edge of town. It had been 30 minutes. Eric had already slowed down his speed after the first 10. Due to the blanket of fog that seemed to only be getting thicker, they didn't know if they were going in circles or not, despite moving in a straight line. Eric stopped the Jeep and hit one fist against his steering wheel. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I'm down to a quarter tank of gas. We can't keep driving around aimlessly." "Maybe the sword can help," offered Nick. "How? By cutting through the fog," sarcasm evident in Eric's tone. But Nick only nodded and slid out of the Jeep. He approached the edge of the fog and slashed the weapon downward. Nothing happened. Then the flamberge blade, staying true to its namesake, engulfed itself in heavenly fire, and Nick could feel a pull towards the side of the road. Treating the sword's point like the makeshift needle of a compass, he headed off in that direction. "Where are you going?" called Eric. "The sword says we need to go this way," Nick yelled back. "The sword says go that way," muttered Eric under his breath. He pulled his Jeep to the side of the road, parked it, and got out. He made sure his gun's safety was on and holstered it before he stormed after Nick, not bothering to lock the Jeep, as the damaged door made it a moot point currently. "It's a library," said Eric, "so now what?" "We go inside," said Nick. The sword had stopped emitting fire, so Nick had sheathed it. Surprisingly, unlike the rest of the town, the library's exterior was in decent condition. "Why should we go into the giant-ass creepy library of death?" asked Eric. "Because it may help us get out of here. Remember what Father Green said, knowledge is power," said Nick. "Besides, it could be worse." "How? It could be a giant-ass creepy hospital instead?" Nick headed up the marble stairs to the entrance. Eric, momentarily recalling the happy nurses from the Quiet Mountain games, shuddered at the idea of actually running into them in real life. He shook off the feeling and caught up to Nick. Inside the room was dimly lit. There was a main checkout counter and various bookshelves lined with books. Various tables with chairs and cushions were set up around the library. Outside the main area, they couldn't see into the darkness beyond. Other than the fact that there were no people here, it looked completely normal and safe, which was setting off alarm bells for both of them. "So now what does the sword want us to do?" asked Eric, his tone a whisper. Nick gave him a look. "What?" said Eric. "I don't think you need to whisper," said Nick, smiling. The two of them jerked and looked around wildly when a horrific scream ripped through the entire library. As quickly as it started, it ended. Eric pulled his gun free, while Nick wrapped his hand around the hilt of the greatsword. Then all hell broke loose. Zombies, actual zombies, came pooling out of the dark catacombs from the back of the library. Eric aimed, but stopped himself from pulling the trigger when Nick rested his hand on his shoulder. Eric shot him a glance when Nick pointed and said, "Up there." Eric turned to where Nick was pointing, to see a spiritual apparition looking down from a second-level balcony. "I think she's controlling the zombies," said Nick. Eric was about to ask why when he noticed the loud humming coming from the Banshee, a death dirge that was allowing her to exercise control over the mob of rot rushing towards them. "Take her out," Nick said. "Dude, it's a ghost. What am I supposed to do? Find a vacuum," Eric said. "They're blessed bullets, right? They should hurt her," said Nick. "Should," Eric responded, incredulousness in his voice. But not having a better idea himself, took aim and opened fire, releasing 2 shots. One pierced through her head, the other her chest. One good thing about being Sheriff Rhodes' son, you were taught how to use a gun. Silence followed as the Banshee simply stopped. Not out of pain, but utter confusion. No one had ever shot at her before. The zombies, without any sense of control coming from the Banshee, simply stood frozen. Then her rage returned, and the Banshee took in a deep breath and... nothing. A pure white light glowed from within her that seemed to silence whatever dark energy she was trying to connect with. "Hey, it worked," said Eric. Nick, "Yeah, but for how long?" He grabbed Eric's hand and pulled him along the front wall. They didn't stop running until they exited into a side chamber attached to the library, stepping into a conservatory. All the plants within were lush green and well taken care of, a contrast to the world outside. Apparently, the evil within the town had failed to corrupt everything. Along with the rows of plants and handfuls of trees, cushioned benches resided at various spots throughout. No doubt a place for people to enjoy the area, rest, and read. "Why are we here?" asked Eric. Nick looked around frantically. "I don't know, but the sword pushed me in this direction," said Nick. Eric, holstering his gun, "Well, if I had to guess, we need to find a special herb to heal ourselves if we get bitten by a zombie." "Really, dude?" said Nick with an emphasis on dude. "Oh, I'm sorry. I get a bit snarky when I'm about to die," said Eric. He looked around and noticed a large plastic chest against the wall. He headed over to it and found gardening and landscaping tools inside. He pulled out a rake and wedged it between the door handles, creating a makeshift barricade. He then went back over to the chest and removed 2 shovels. "I'm guessing we need to start digging. Any chance that great sword of yours knows where to start?" Nick drew the greatsword once more. He extended it outward and slowly began to wave it across the conservatory. Once he pointed at the back left corner, he felt the weapon get considerably warm in his grip, but it didn't ignite like the last time, which Nick was thankful for. "Over there," he said. Eric made his way in that direction when there was a loud thud against the conservatory entrance. Nick and Eric turned to see the horde of zombies throwing themselves against the wall. The Banshee, however, wasn't anywhere in sight. "Oh goody, they're back! Thankfully there's a large glass wall to stop them," said Eric before he quickened his pace to the back of the room. Nick, keeping his sword out, followed. He vigilantly looked for the evil spirit controlling them. He stopped short when he came up beside Eric, who was frozen in place. Nick was about to ask why when he noticed a little girl sitting on a bench feet kicking as she hummed to herself. She was eating goldfish from a large box and reading a picture book about 2 penguins who baked cakes. A rosebush sat to her right. Hello," said Eric. The little girl looked up and smiled brightly. "Hi," she said, then went back to her book. Eric shared a look with Nick. Nick shrugged. Eric rolled his eyes. "You do that a lot," he said, imitating the gesture with his own shoulders. Nick had to stop himself from doing it again in response. "Where's your mom and dad?" Eric asked the little girl. The thudding of bodies against glass was getting louder. Nick considered shifting, but thought better of it, unsure how the kid would react to seeing a scary gargoyle. "Heaven after the car crash," said the girl. "That's what Father Green told me." "We know Father Green, too," said Eric. "Does he know you're here?" The girl nodded. "He told me to stay here until he could send some people to help me." "Why here and not the church?" asked Nick. The little girl shrugged. "I don't know." Why Father Green hadn't told them about the girl when they got the sword was concerning, but he had hinted at her location when they left. Regardless, they couldn't exactly call and ask him, and they had no intention of driving back to the church. "Well," said Eric, who was kneeling so he was level with her, "I know you're not supposed to go with strangers, but my friend and I can take you with us, if you want." The little girl thought about it for a moment, placing a hand over a pendant. One, Nick noticed, that resembled the Archangel Michael. She closed her book in the box of goldfish. She slipped off the bench and pulled out her unicorn backpack that had been lying underneath it. She stuffed her book and goldfish inside and zipped it up and put it on. "Okay, it's boring here, and I've been waiting forever," she said. "I'm Sarah." She held out her hand for Eric to shake. Eric smiled and shook it. "I'm Eric, and this is Nick." He gestured with his head toward Nick. Nick, who was still gripping the sword tightly, gave a quick wave and smile, then immediately returned his free hand to the hilt. It was at that moment that a loud crash of glass could be heard coming from the front of the conservatory. "We should go," said Nick, "now." Eric stood up and kept Sarah's hand in his. "Sarah, is there another way out of here?" Sarah nodded. She started pulling Eric to the back of the conservatory to a side door marked emergency exit. As Eric pushed it open, an alarm went off. Eric then bent over, picked Sarah up, and ran outside. Nick followed close behind. "We need to get back to the car," yelled Nick as he and Eric rushed around the front of the library towards the stone steps. "Jeep," corrected Eric. "Doggies," exclaimed Sarah. They stopped at the top of the steps as 2 voidlings, shaped like pit bulls, stepped out of the fog. These dog-like monsters were able to extend their maws to an exaggerated width, as they could unhinge their jaws and had rows of sharp teeth inside them. Sarah went from excitement to fear as the 7-year-old realized the 2 doggies were not friendly. Eric drew his gun. "Close your eyes and cover your ears," Eric told Sarah. He then fired 1 shot single-handedly at each of the vile mutts as they charged forward. One was able to get out of the way, but the other was pierced through the head and dispersed back to the void. Eric had 1 bullet left. He took aim at the other voidling again, but stopped short after Nick, a gargoyle once more, rushed past and thrust the greatsword into the charging voidling's maw, felling the beast in one hit as he rammed a majority of the blade down the dog's gullet. Eric looked to Sarah, who was staring wide-eyed at Nick. "Cool," she said. "Very cool," said Eric. "Is he your boyfriend?" asked Sarah. "My older brother has a boyfriend, but my mom and dad don't like to talk about that. Well, they used to not to." Eric wasn't sure how to respond, but was just glad the girl wasn't screaming or crying. "Nope," said Eric. "He's just my friend." He then hurried down the steps, just as an explosion of glass shards and wood splinters showered the outside as a horrific scream of agony, fury, and hatred ripped its way free of the library, so loud it even dulled out the noise of the emergency exit for a moment. Nick, Eric, and Sarah turned to see the zombie horde rushing forward once more. The Banshee herself phased through the wall, and upon seeing the three of them, pointed and cast a dark bolt of necrotic energy at them. Nick went to strike the magic with the flamberge, once more wreathed in heavenly fire, just as a circle of protective light shone around the three of them. Eric and Nick looked at the sword, but the weapon hadn't reacted as far as they could tell. They then noticed a bright light of energy glowing around Sarah's pendant. Sarah, what's that?" Eric asked. "Father Green gave it to me. He said it would keep me safe from the bad stuff," said Sarah, "that I should never take it off or the bad things would get me. That's how I knew you two wouldn't hurt me. The necklace wouldn't let you." "Awesome," said Nick. "Jeep now." Eric nodded his agreement, and the two of them ran deeper into the fog. They had run a good 20 feet when they realized that the fog that had been blocking their path initially seemed to be parting for them, as if it were no longer trying to keep them there. They had just gotten to the Jeep when they heard yet another wail from the Banshee and heard the moans of the undead getting louder. Nick, who had shifted back to human, placed the sheathed greatsword in the back seat and hustled to the passenger side. Eric jumped in the driver's side after yanking the door open and handed Sarah over to Nick, before he slammed his door shut and started the engine. "Seatbelts," said Sarah. Nick and Eric quickly buckled up. Nick, with Sarah still in his lap, placed the shoulder strap over her chest. Not the safest option, but better than nothing. Eric then gunned it down the road. The fog still seemed to be spreading away from them. While their visibility was less than ideal, it wasn't as restricted. They actually felt like they were making progress out of town now. They even recognized a gas station they had passed when they had first entered Usher's Tarn. They knew they were close to home free when shooting up out of the ground ahead of them was the Banshee once more. With murder in her eyes, the Banshee began to wail. The three of them braced for the worst when it seemed as if the Banshee was choking. Alongside her, Father Green manifested himself, and using his psychic gifts, seemed to be choking the Banshee like he was Darth Vader. A telepathic message resonated through Eric's brain. "Go now," yelled Father Green. "I can't hold her off for long." Eric, not needing to be told twice, roared his Jeep forward, swerving around the Banshee and outside the borders of Usher's Tarn. It had been a week since their adventure. Eric's stepdad, Sheriff Rhodes, more accurately Eric's mom, had decided to foster Sarah. All the girl could tell them was that her parents had died in a car accident, presumably in Usher's Tarn. The problem was there was no Usher's Tarn. It had burned down to the ground 50 years ago. Child Protective Services had found Sarah's older brother, Hayden Keep, who was a 20-year-old college student. He didn't have the financial means or time to care for his sister. He was sad to hear about his parents, but relieved his sister was safe. He hadn't heard from them for a month, which wasn't terribly odd. He and his parents hadn't been much on speaking terms after he had come out to them 2 years ago. He happily agreed to let the Rhodes foster Sarah in Normal and had made plans to visit over the upcoming fall break. The gentleman had paid both Nick and Eric in full and assured them that he was aware of Father Green's concerns and that he would take the utmost care of the greatsword while it was under his care. He had with him someone who was presumably a human who collected the sword. The gentleman also informed them that their services would most likely be called on again. The summer court appreciated those who were successful in their endeavors. As for Nick and Eric, things went back to normal for the most part, for the both of them. Their usual late-night shifts, Eric getting a late dinner, and odd sleeping schedules. While the evenly split $50,000 was a nice padding in each of their bank accounts, it was hardly life-changing in today's economy. So the two of them kept to their regular lives in Normal, each of them occasionally checking in on Sarah during the weekends. But both were more than happy to not have to deal with Faye business for a while.